Actually, it's Herbert and Cristiano. So my name is Herbert Bos. I'm presenting together with Cristiano Giuffrida our work on poking holes. And if you look carefully, we are actually the last authors on the paper. So the reason that we are presenting is that our student Angelos is sick. He called in sick. He called us from the airport. He was at the gate and said, "I can't board. I'm not feeling well. Sorry." And so I said, that's really bad. But send me your latest version of your slides, and we'll see what we can do. And then he said, "Wait, what slides?" Right? So and so for the students in the audience, I wanna just say, we love this, right? So we really like to make a presentation a day in advance of a conference, all the way from scratch. But anyway, let's see what we're gonna look at today. What we're gonna do is again attack information hiding, and we're gonna assume the ideal implementation of information hiding, even if that is not available today. And what we're gonna see is that we can break information hiding without some of the assumptions that we saw in the previous talk in seconds, right? And I'm going to use very few probes to do that, and the primitives that we need for that are pervasive in modern software, especially server programs. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. In the previous talk, we already saw that ASLR today doesn't give you a very strong protection in and of itself, but it's still a pivotal defense in other techniques that are much more powerful in the way they protect your systems. So all of these defenses rely on randomization, although it's not randomization by itself that provides a strong protection. So shadow stacks were an example of that. You separate the stack which contains the sensitive information and you put it somewhere else where the attacker cannot find it, right? That is the idea. And just so ASLR has been around for some 15 years now, and to show you how this has changed, the defenses have changed, we put together a little timeline. So ASLR is a technique that started in 2001. Very quickly thereafter, it was shown that it's not very good on 32-bit systems. The entropy is simply too low. But over time, the technique was improved. 64-bit machines became common, and we got more finer-grained ASLR. So things were pretty good for some time, until a couple of years ago when just-in-time code reuse showed that an attacker needs only a single information leak to chase pointers and thus find all the gadgets, all the information that it needs to stitch together a malicious payload. Okay, so that changed the game a little bit, so we needed new defenses, and this is when the whole class of defenses that rely on information hiding came about. So here we have sensitive information, so all of the pointers, we remove them from memory, all the interesting pointers for an attacker, we remove them from memory that an attacker can reach and place them in a hidden region somewhere. And we make sure that there is not a single pointer pointing to that hidden region, okay? So that even if you leak information from memory, you will not find the hidden region. Okay. Now, it turned out that if you have a really, really large hidden region, an attacker might still be able to find it by means of side channels. Okay. So this was shown in 2015, but in more recent defenses, the focus has been on really small hidden regions. Okay. And the current state of the art is, I think what we just saw in the previous presentation, if we are able to, even if it's a small amount of memory in the hidden region, but we can grow it, for instance, by means of threat spraying, we might still be able to reduce the entropy sufficiently to break information hiding. Now, in this talk, we're going to assume ideal information hiding. So it's the smallest possible chunk of secret information that you can find, say 4K, 1 page. Okay. We're going to assume there's not a single pointer in memory that points to this. There's a dedicated register that points to this, and no memory pointers that point to it. It's as small as possible, and moreover, it does not grow during the execution of the program. So threat spraying, where we actually increase the size of the hidden region, would not work in this particular case. Also, similar attacks would not work. So we don't grow the hidden region. That's the assumption. Now, this is all done in general, the information hiding techniques, so that we can have a threat model where an arbitrary read-write primitive is okay, right? So this is the assumption for these more powerful defenses. Okay, so our question, of course, is, the research question is, how safe is this if we have this ideal information hiding technique? Okay, and to answer that, we're going to look at a Linux process in memory, and it's a position-independent executable, which looks roughly like this. So at the top we have the stack. A stack which grows downwards, and then below that we have an area with the heap and some code and mmap area, and they only cover a very small amount of the total address space, right? So much of the address space is not mapped at all. It's a hole. These are the holes in the address space. Okay, and the three main holes in the address space are the three holes that are pointed at here. There's some smaller ones also, but these are the ones that we need to worry about. Okay, so the holes in the address space. And if we generate some secret region, some hidden region, it's going to be put at a random location somewhere in one of these holes. For instance, this could be the large hole at the bottom, which is actually a very, very large hole indeed. Okay, so this would be one page of memory that is the hidden region somewhere in this enormous hole. Okay, and just to show you how large these holes are, the hole at the bottom, hole number A, ranges between, so it's a random-sized hole that ranges between 130 terabytes and 131 terabytes, and in that enormous space, there's one page that you're looking for. Okay. Could also be in one of the other holes, which are a little bit smaller. Okay. So probing just for that small chunk of information, that 4K page, is probably not going to be a very feasible attack. It's going to take a long time. So what we're going to do instead is not probe for the hidden region, but rather probe for actually the holes. So we want to know how large the holes are. And the intuition here is that, yes, we've removed all of the pointers that point to this hidden region from memory, right? This no longer happens. But there's always one pointer left, right? The one pointer that is left is the size of the hole itself. If we know the size of either of these holes, we can use this as an offset, because it starts at a known base. We can use it as an offset, and then we have a pointer that points to the hidden region. That is the intuition of the attack. Now, what we want to leak is the size of this largest hole, this, for instance, this pointer here. Okay. But that is not something that is written in user space memory, and you just have to leak that information so you know it. But you can try to infer the size of the hole. So we're going to side channel the kernel to reveal the size of this hole. Okay? So the intuition is as follows. What we're going to do is we're going to make the program that we're attacking repeatedly allocate very large chunks of memory. Okay? And then see whether or not the allocation succeeded or failed. Okay? So let's say we allocate a chunk of memory of size L. It's a very large chunk, and it was successful. Then we know that the hole was at least this size. Right? So then we try a different size, a larger size. Okay, so this is a successful one. We try again with a larger size, and oops, this was too large, didn't fit. So the allocation failed. And that means that the size of the hole has to be less than that. Okay, so we do it again, and we keep doing that until finally we hit the exact size of that hole. Okay, and as you can probably guess, this is a binary search. So it's very quick. We need very few probes to do this. Okay, so then we find the right size. So the way we do this in practice is we're going to use what we termed ephemeral allocation primitives. So this is something that does an allocation on your victim program And it has a very short lifetime. For instance, the lifetime of a request. You make a request to a server, it allocates some memory, does some stuff, sends back a reply, and frees the memory. Okay? So the allocation will only remain there until the reply has been returned to the client. So the strategy that we have is, for instance, in a client-server scenario, we have a client that constantly sends requests to the server asking it to allocate memory. So there has to be a way the attacker has to control the size of the allocation. We'll talk about that in a minute. Once the attacker has that, you can just repeatedly send requests to the server to allocate, and then it will be freed again. Okay? So for explanation purposes, just for the simplicity of it, we're going to assume that there's only a single hidden region, and it happens to be allocated in the largest hole. Okay, this is the most likely scenario, but in the paper, if you're interested, we also generalize this. What if we have multiple regions, multiple hidden regions that are maybe allocated in different holes? Okay, just for simplicity, we're going to assume the single region and the largest hole. So if we allocate a hidden region in hole A, the hidden region will split the hole in two holes, right? So there's an area that is above the hidden region, and an area that's below the hidden region. And we find the size of the largest hole there via this binary search. And to do that, we basically maintain two values, two estimates. One for the lower estimate for the size of this hole, lower, which is the total size of the, this is the minimum size of the hole that it could have possibly been, so 130 terabytes, minus this one page, minus the 4 kilobytes, divided by 2. Okay? So that is, at least the size of this hole. And then there's an upper estimate, so the maximum that it can be is the maximum size of this total hole, the size of hole A, minus this 4K page. Okay? And then we keep allocating and monitoring the success of the allocations. So here we see that the first allocation was successful, so we increased the lower estimate. Okay? And then the next allocation was not successful, so the upper estimate, the estimate of upper, has to be at least one page below this allocation, right? And so we keep doing that. The next one is successful, the next one is successful, and the last one is not successful. So now we know exactly the size of L. Okay? And that works as a pointer. So what we've done is we've reduced this enormous entropy that we had, these 47 bits that you have in a user space process, down to 1 bit. And the 1 bit that we don't know is whether or not the large hole in A is above the hidden region or below the hidden region. But we reduced the entropy to just 1 bit, which I think is a terrific result.
Of course, it would be great if we could address this, right? And actually drop the last bit of entropy. Luckily, we found another primitive, which we termed persistent allocation primitive, to do exactly this. So you might recognize the code at this point. It's very similar to the code of the ephemeral allocation primitive, right? For each request, we trigger an allocation, which is with a size that we control. But the difference is that there is no deallocation, essentially, in the middle of the primitive, which means now our allocation is persistent. Now, if you want to craft this primitive in real programs, it turns out it's relatively difficult to do so. But what we found is that we can actually often turn an existing ephemeral primitive into a persistent one. The intuition is that lots of server programs do allocations whose lifetime is attached to events which are directly exposed and controllable by attackers. So the typical example is for each connection, a server program is going to allocate a per connection buffer, which means if we keep the connection open, then the allocation is going to stay somewhere on the heap, and it's going to be persistent. Similarly, server programs keep per request buffers, so you just keep completing the request and reply interaction with the server, and again, the allocation is persistent. Okay, so once we craft both an ephemeral primitive and a persistent primitive, we can finally drop the last bit and break even an ideal information hiding implementation. How do we do this in our end-to-end attack? We can go through the steps again. So in step 1, as you remember, we do binary search through our ephemeral primitive to quickly determine L. In step 2, we're going to use our persistent primitive to fill L. So we trigger an allocation, a persistent allocation of size L, and this essentially causes the program to remove the hole, the largest hole from the address space, okay? Then in step 3, things are simple at this point, right? We fill the hole. All we have to do is reliably read memory with our arbitrary memory read primitive, and we're going to do so at hole button address, at the bottom of the hole, essentially, plus L, which we have already leaked. Now, if we reconsider the two scenarios we've seen before, what happens in the first scenario is that by doing this arbitrary memory read, we're going to read data at this offset from the hidden area, right? In the other scenario, we start at the bottom, we read at this offset, and we're going to read in the middle of L. But remember that at step 2, we filled L, right, with our own allocation. So what we're going to do is just read 0 bits from 0 pages coming from our allocation. And by looking at the result of the memory read, we can distinguish between zeros and data from the hidden region. So we finally drop the last bit of entropy, and we can determine in which scenario we are and infer the location of the hidden area. Okay? So how do we implement all of this in practice? So of course, we need a way to affect large allocations repeatedly, and also a way to detect whether each allocation failed or succeeded. Okay? So for the first part, what we do is looking for code snippets like this in real programs. This is taken from Nginx, and it's code executed every time you create a new connection. What Nginx will do is call this function Nginx create pool, which creates a per connection pool. Okay? And it will do so taking a size, reading a pool size from memory. This actually comes from a configuration file, and this variable is stored in long-lived memory, which means it's always there, which means if you have an arbitrary memory write primitive, you can corrupt the memory and craft our primitives. Of course, to craft an ephemeral primitive, all we have to do is open the connection, trigger the allocation, close the connection. To turn this into a persistent primitive, we just keep the connection open. Very simple. So, but how do we find many of these code snippets in real programs? We've actually built a tool to do this. And what our tool does is it expects a server to be in some form of quiescent state. Then it taints all memory to simulate an arbitrary memory write controlling all memory. And then it does dynamic taint analysis while we probe the server to figure out which tainted bytes end up in the allocation size argument of our candidate allocation size. So in this particular example on Nginx, our tool will report that there's a number of bytes in long-lived memory which are tainted, and these bytes end up essentially in the pool size argument. So we now know we can craft a primitive and mount our end-to-end attack using this code snippet, abusing this code snippet. Okay, so for the first part, of course, we need a way to detect whether the allocation failed or not. So there's a number of options here. The first one is the most common. It's what we call direct observation. You pretty much, in a web server like Nginx, you pretty much just look at the result of the HTTP response, right? So the intuition is if the allocation succeeds, the server is going to be pretty happy to use a larger buffer, even if it's terabytes. Nginx, in this case, doesn't care, right? It's just going to serve the HTTP request and come back with a response and a positive status code, so HTTP 200. Okay? So in the other case, when the allocation fails, we have an out-of-memory situation, and if you're lucky, with Nginx we're lucky, there is error code paths in the server which handle this situation and just gracefully send back an error code 500 in this case. So you just distinguish between the two cases. In some other cases, you might be less lucky, right? So the application doesn't deal with out-of-memory events, and it just crashes, right? Of course, crashes are not a game over, right, for server programs, because they will just respawn a new worker process, so you can continue. But what's more interesting is that now we have a fault side channel, but just detecting a crash, just by probing the state of the connection, we can detect that the allocation failed and distinguish from the positive case again. We found other cases where you might be really out of luck. There's no direct observation that is going to save you to distinguish the two cases. There's no fault side channel. But what you can still do is look for timing side channels. Okay? So what this means is that you can measure the time it takes to complete a request-reply iteration, and perhaps, depending on the time it takes to complete the whole sequence, you can learn properties on the allocation. A typical example is whenever an allocation succeeds, if you look at what the kernel does, most of the time this huge allocation will be served by a VMA cache. So you get a VMA cache hit, and the kernel, the execution returns immediately to user land. So this is fast, right? That's the fast path. When you have an unsuccessful allocation, the kernel typically will encounter a VMA cache miss, and this will prompt the kernel to trigger a lengthy walk of a red-black tree data structure, which takes measurably longer. So if you time the entire operation, you will be able to distinguish the two allocation scenarios and, again, leak the information you want. A few practical examples of this. In Nginx, we were able to do this by a direct observation. Every time an allocation fails, what Nginx does is pretty much just a connection, prompt the connection close event. In Lydie, we were a bit unlucky at first. So what we observed is this peculiar case of no matter what the allocation does, right, whether it succeeds or not, Lydie crashes. And the reason for this is that when the allocation fails, you get an out-of-memory event which is not handled, so Lydie just crashes. And we kind of expected this. What we did not anticipate is the other scenario, where what happens is Lydie, after a successful allocation, it will try to use our size that we control, the huge size, to actually initialize this buffer, right? So what it would do is, oh, I have a terabyte buffer, no problem. I'm just going to go through it and initialize it with zeros, right? So what this does is just triggering many page faults with the kernel struggling to pin physical memory pages to this huge terabyte buffer. Of course, you run into physical memory exhaustion problems at some point, and you just crash, right? But the nice property of this is that, of course, now you have a timing side channel to distinguish between the two scenarios, as the many page faults take a long time to be handled. So this takes, again, measurably longer. So you can time the time it takes to complete the whole interaction and distinguish the two cases again. Okay, so we did an analysis also on other server applications by applying our tool with a semi-automated analysis. And we found a total of 13 primitives across 4 server applications: bind, Lydie, MySQL, and Nginx. What you see in this table is the properties of the top performing primitive. So as you can see, we found ephemeral primitives in all these applications, persistent primitives in all these applications. And we also looked at whether the primitives were crash-free or not. The only case where we were not able to find crash-free primitives was Lydie. But again, this is not a deal breaker, essentially. You can just respawn processes. And our attack is so fast that you're not going to encounter many crashes in practice. So we also looked at how fast this is, of course. So it turns out this is pretty fast. One reason is that allocations and the allocations are very cheap and efficient primitives, of course. The other more important reason is that the complexity of our end-to-end attack is logarithmic with the size of the address space. Because again, when probing for the holes, we do binary search. So this is super efficient, right? And this translates to just 37 probes in the very worst case on Nginx when probing for a single hole, essentially, for an ideal information hiding implementation, okay? And we can do all of this in a crash-free fashion and just completing the attack in a matter of seconds, or even milliseconds, depending on how fast your arbitrary memory write primitive actually is, okay? So if we contrast this with existing memory scanning primitives, which linearly scan the address space, say remote side channels, crop, of course, the time complexity of the end-to-end attack in this case is linear, which means it will take a long time before you can actually find an object which is as small as the hidden area for our ideal information hiding implementation. If you do some math, this is 2 to the power of 35 probes in the very worst case, of course. OK. So something I should mention is that all the results we reported on our server applications make an assumption. And the assumption is that memory overcommit is enabled. What this means is that the operating system should allow virtual allocations beyond the amount of available physical memory. So this is a relatively common setup in server settings. And in fact, it's even required by some applications, such as Redis, Hadoop, virtualization environments, and so on. However, keep in mind that even when overcommit is disabled, allocation oracles are still possible. It just means that the attacker has to do a little bit more work to bypass overcommit restrictions. So if you're familiar with Linux, what you can do, for instance, is corrupt the mmap flags to convince the kernel not to count a particular allocation towards overcommit restrictions. So to conclude, we presented allocation oracles. We think this is pretty cool primitives against ASLR, which shown that end-to-end attacks using allocation oracles are efficient, layout agnostic in the sense that no matter what your information hiding-based defense does, we can bypass it. The primitives we found are relatively pervasive in real-world programs. And what we can do with this now is we can bypass all the information hiding defenses, hiding-based defenses. And in fact, we show that even an ideal information hiding implementation is insufficient. So you can patch this problem by disabling overcommit, for instance, limiting the problem, or capping the size of the address space, or for instance, using authenticated page mapper, which Anes presented just before this talk. But we believe that at this point, with these results, it's really time for our community to reconsider our fate in information hiding and switch instead to stronger data and metadata protection techniques based on strong isolation. That's it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. So it was a very impressive talk given the preparation time. So maybe your students should get sick more frequently.
Yeah.
And there is the first question. So Ben.
Yeah. Hi, Ben Stock, Saarland University. Cool talk, thanks. I was wondering, you said that it takes some measurable time to allocate memory, so you can do that even in over the network. Does it also work for a remote attacker? I believe you probably tried this HTTP side channel over a local network connection, right? Or did you try it over the internet?
So we tried basically, so everything we did and we tried over the network. The example I described on the VMA cache is just a speculative example because we actually didn't need that. So if I go back to my table, the only case, and sorry I'm not showing this here, but the only case was we really needed a time inside channel was Liddy. But this time inside channel you can literally do over the slowest network you want because you have so many space faults that so it's the strongest time inside channel you can ever imagine. Essentially, it takes a very long time for Liddy to crash, of course. So you can measure this easily over the network.
Can you quantify very longs, like minutes, seconds, milliseconds?
I think it's several seconds.
Okay.
I don't remember the exact figures, but it's several seconds.
Okay. And
if I remember correctly.
I'll go before
Depends on the amount of RAM you have, of course, right?
Okay.
So it's.
And one other thing is, so at NDSS there was work presented on re-randomization of child processes for servers like Nginx. Would this, I mean, if in the crash case, this would also probably mean that the memory would be re-randomized, so the hidden information would be somewhere else, right? Would this prevent such attacks?
Right. So if you have crash-free primitives and you're re-randomizing every time you crash, it will completely bypass that. But if you have, in the case of Liddy, we need crashes. So if there is randomization, this could be stopped, essentially. But that's one of the data points.
All right, thanks.
Yeah, Thorsten Holz, Ruhr University, Bochum. Do you think that there's a way to defend against this kind of attacks by, let's say, I do just many allocations of small pages just to spray my own memory space in order to hide the interesting things? Or is this...
Sorry, I didn't catch the first part of the question, Thorsten.
Yeah, how to defend against this kind of attacks. So can I just spray my own address space with just random allocations, some kind of traps?
Fake ones?
Yeah, fake ones that will probably fill up my page table entries and everything, but still, is it feasible or not?
So the problem with this countermeasure, we thought about this, right? So I think it's a feasible defense if you can somehow prevent the attackers from reading, essentially, from the target regions. The problem is that with allocation oracles, what we can do with the persistent primitives is literally fill the address space, right? So we show more details in the paper. But imagine with the combination of ephemeral and persistent, you will completely pollute the address space with 0 pages. And then if you have an arbitrary memory read, you can literally read from anywhere without crashing. And you can easily distinguish, again, 0 pages from actual data, assuming you can read that data. right? Then you will always be able to distinguish dummy objects, essentially. But you could deploy defenses that prevent the arbitrary memory read of sensitive data, and that approach would be more interesting.
Hi, this is Ispos from Purdue University, and I found this type of attack very interesting, but after all, it's very easy for someone to mitigate it just by moving the hidden region in another hole. So in that case, can you do something similar, or?
So mitigate this by?
By just moving the hidden area in another hole. Is this possible, first of all? And if so?
No, so keep in mind that, as Herbert suggested in the presentation, we overly simplified the details, right? We actually do not make, if you look at the paper, we do not make any assumption on the number of hidden regions that you have. You can have 1 million, you can have 1, 2, 3, and we do not make any assumptions on the actual hole. I'm just going to give you the intuition here, back to the first question, right? With a combination of ephemeral and persistent, what you're going to be doing is first leak the size of the largest hole in the address space, right? Then you fill it in with the persistent primitive. Then you go to the second largest hole. You repeat the binary search. You leak the size. You fill it in. You keep doing this until you pollute everything, and then you can do reliable, within the threat model, reliably read anything in the address space, and you have the coordinates of the different sizes of the holes you filled as guidelines, and then you basically poke around looking for, oh yeah, this looks like my hidden region number 3, right? And then you can fingerprint essentially everything and break any defenses. That's what we mean by layout agnostic. You can pretty much do this with any defense, provided you can do arbitrary memory reads, of course.
So if I understand correctly, you can do something similar for the heap and stack allocations, for the hole between stack and heap, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's completely layout agnostic. It doesn't really matter in which hole you are, so you're not safe.
Mm-hmm. Oh, okay, thank you very much.
Okay, great. Thanks the speakers again.
Oh yeah.